Okay. Well, all of that is about motivation, right? So we have been talking over these sessions about andragogy, which is understanding and principles to guide us as we teach adult learners. Understanding that that is different than teaching children. And so many of us, the only education we've received on how to teach is the informal education of being taught. And so what we're doing in this course is we're working on understanding the actual principles so that we can better apply them and work better, like Carol said, to engage, or like our other participants said, to how do people change, how do people grow, and what part do we play in that? And so when Malcolm Knowles, who did the 5 principles of andragogy, he talked about the fact that adults are internally motivated to learn. And so he had these assumptions that we have the readiness to learn, self-concept. We've talked about some of these in the other classes. The fact that an adult learner wants to use relevance and their own experiences. And so he added this motivation to learn later, years after he had the other assumptions. And so what he was saying is that as a child, you have to go to school, right? I heard someone this morning on a podcast refer to college as non-required additional school or something like that, where it was like, wait, why would I do that? Like you have to go up to a certain grade. And so children have these external pressures, right? I just dropped both of my children off at school in 4th grade and 8th grade. They didn't have a choice. That's what they had. That's where they're going for the day. And so the idea was that all of us, we technically can kind of stop learning at a certain point if we want. And so what Knowles said is that we have these internal motivators, like you guys mentioned, like, Carol mentioning, like, I want to engage my students. Well, I know for a fact that you all know teachers who are not that worried about that. They are not trying to engage their students anymore. They're just putting out information. They're just lecturing or whatever it may be. And so what Knowles said is that each adult has their own internal motivation that is individual to them. Now, intrinsic motivation, or that internal motivation, is, I would say that it can be an interesting thing to think about and talk about, because while I may just want to learn, just out of the interest of learning, I may also feel that if I learn to do this skill better, if I learn to do whatever better, that maybe I'll get a promotion, or that maybe I'll keep my job, or whatever it may be. So, we could make the argument that not all adult motivation is intrinsic. There may be a combination, and perhaps if you have that intrinsic motivation, maybe you're going to come to something with more openness and engagement. But either way, we want to take advantage of the fact that if someone is motivated to come to that class or to do whatever you are doing with them, let's take advantage of it. So, I kind of ask the questions, is wanting to get a raise or a promotion, is that intrinsic? Is that extrinsic? And almost doesn't matter. The point is there's a motivation there that we can take advantage of. Exactly, Carol. And what we've seen, Carol's comment is that in treatment, an example of external motivation is mandated treatment. And from the research that I've seen, people who are in treatment through mandated or court ordered are just as successful as those who come in, quote unquote, voluntarily, especially if we find that kernel of, yes, you were, quote unquote, forced to be here. But I've always told my clients, yeah, you're, quote unquote, have to be here, but really you don't, because unless the doors are locked and you can't leave, then you're still making a choice. And if we can find that kernel of motivation, we can work with it. So just kind of something I wanted to bring up because Knowles is talking about it as being all intrinsic, and I don't know that that's accurate, but it gets a little blurry. So I am a big fan of motivational enhancement. Our colleague there mentioned the change process, and that's a huge part of this. And I think that we can apply a lot of the same things that we do in motivational enhancement with teaching. We can express empathy with whomever is in front of us. You know, oh, I know how busy you are. And I understand that this is difficult. I understand that you're juggling a lot of different things, whatever it may be. We can develop discrepancy if someone, especially a student we have for a while, is telling us, well, I really want to go to graduate school, or I really want to go to law school, or I really want to get an A in this class. And yet at the same time, you cannot, you don't see the amount of work that they're putting in, or you'd like to see more work being put in. So, we can use some of these same things, which I love, because I personally don't like to have to start, to reinvent the wheel. I like to use things that we already have available to us. Yes, Dr. Kowal, empathy to me, you're probably rarely going to hear me doing any kind of training that I don't talk about empathy. And Carol said, yet often providers will not refer people to services if they believe they don't have internal motivation, yet they end up doing really well, while others with internal motivation can abandon treatment after 2 days. Absolutely. One of the things that I found is people who are voluntary, then they go, well, I came in so I can just walk out if I want, right? And as opposed to someone who kind of has to be there, so they settle in a little bit and maybe start to take things in. As you said, you just can't predict. And I hope, and maybe I'm wrong, but I hope that we're moving away from that. They're not ready, so they can't be in treatment. And then we're using some of the, I hope. Fair enough, Carol. So, we can avoid argumentation. One thing, like when my students are in class and disagreeing with something I'm saying, I really encourage that, because that's a form of engagement, right? So if a student is saying, well, like I teach a drugs and crime course, if they're like, well, I don't think marijuana is not addictive, let's say, that's a form of engagement. They're discussing with me and with the class. So instead of getting into an argument with them, well, what's your experience with that? Why do you think that? Here's what I've seen. Here's what I know, and trying to have a conversation rather than kind of shutting things down. Similar to rolling with resistance, right? So again, students are going to have times that they don't agree with how we do things, and that's okay. That, again, can be a form of engagement rather than apathy. And then supporting self-efficacy, which we pretty much had a whole course on, Module 1. If you didn't get a chance to see it, we have the recording. And so all of these things can be really fantastic things to do as a professor, as an instructor, as a trainer, as well as, of course, as a clinician. So one thing that happened later in the adult learning theory, is that there was this adaptation to the original. So as I said, there was this idea that adults are motivated to learn, and it was changed to now being by both extrinsic and intrinsic motivators. And so activities should demonstrate to the learner where he or she would benefit in their job. Because if we look at just intrinsic motivation, then it's almost like we're off the hook in terms of trying to motivate. And I think that we always want to show, why is this information I'm sharing with you? Why is this work we're doing in our very busy lives? Why is that important? I wouldn't want to teach you all this today without respect that, you're taking an hour and 15 minutes out of your day, and that I want you to leave with something that's valuable to you. So moving, still highly related, but moving slightly from motivation into more engagement. Our job is more than just passing on information or content. We want to help others to think. So it's kind of like the example I gave earlier, where if the student disagrees with me, great, they're engaging with the material. They're thinking about what I'm saying instead of just sitting at the foot of the guru or the instructor and taking the information. We want to engage participants to create, discover, and apply the learning. So I just gave an exam and I gave my students some essays, and they really liked the fact that the essays were more kind of opinion based. Now they thought it was an opinion. It was really reflecting on all the concepts that they learned. So it wasn't like they could just come in and give me any opinion and it would be, given a good grade, but it was them integrating that information and actually doing something with it rather than just regurgitating something. Right, Carol? It's building on their own knowledge and experiences, which adults want to do. It's a lot more difficult to do that with children, obviously, because they have very limited experiences. Although even then, it can be important and makes the learner feel valued to use things that, I love when I have someone in my course who has some experience. Like I have some people who are in the military and they'll share, how drugs and crime comes into things in the military. I don't have that experience. I'm not afraid as an educator to say, well, what's your experience of that? Now, as a new educator years ago, I was, because I wanted to be the expert and know everything. But when you get to a point where you realize you don't, and you realize that it's valuable for students to be able to share something new, I think you get better engagement. You let go of some of that ego. So with collaboration, there's this idea of a hierarchical model where the trainer is the teacher and the student is the learner, but we want collaboration. We want to the point we were just talking about, we want to throw away the assumption that the student knows less, because that may not be the case in some examples. We are providing tools and structures and we're guiding the group. And yes, of course, we're sharing information, but that's not our only purpose. We want to have a more flexible agenda. We can't predict what's going to happen. If we're talking or training and students have needs or questions, I often find that my students will start asking me questions about things that I wouldn't have anticipated, and we go down a different route. Now, sometimes I have to bring them back if there's things that we need to share or go over, but I never discourage their exploration of going a certain way. So here are some ways we can engage. We can do action planning, brainstorming. So what are some ideas or things that they think are important? Energizers, getting them involved and getting them up and moving so they're not just kind of sitting there like, oh, okay. Reviewing something as a group, doing structured problem solving. This is a great one. Like we have a case study or we have an issue. What do you guys think you would do in that case? Those are really good. I also do teach backs, where I'll put the students in groups and give them a concept that I would have taught that day and have them teach it to the group, to the rest of the group. And that's really valuable because I promise you, when I ask them about that on their exam, they remember that concept because they had to integrate it and teach it to someone else. They don't always love it. Some of them do. It depends on their personality and their learning style, right? Some of them hate it and get nervous, but then then they can maybe be the note taker. They don't always have to present. We want to be aware of those. So I kind of like this idea of teaching versus facilitating to value engagement. So instead of, like I said, this teacher on high sending information, or clinically a counselor on high giving information to their clients, you are shaping that process together. What is it that they want to learn? How do we bring that back? How do we make it more of a, so if my students start asking me about something they're really interested and engaged in, how do I bring more of that into the class? I want to pause and look at some of these comments. So I saw a comment that those were nice engagement techniques. Thank you. When I do case studies with adults with experience, I have small groups write up their own case study. Yes. Then have them engage them with another group to analyze one of the real case studies from another group. That's so valuable, Carol, because for one thing, I don't know about you, but even though I've done this for so long, I'm terrible at writing case studies. Somehow I just make them so generic when I start writing them. But also they are like, and then when the other group starts talking about it, the other group can be like, yeah, well, we tried that, but that didn't work. Or, you know, they can give feedback and make it real.
Also, because I do a lot of international training, I feel like if I write into the curriculum a case study that may be appropriate for Central America, it's not going to be appropriate for the Caribbean or for South America.
Right.
So when they write their own case studies, they're working with their real population.
Yeah, there's no way to have them all ready and have them all, yep, culturally appropriate. Yep, that's a great point too. And it shows you also what people in that area are dealing with and what's real to them. Excellent. So to that point, when we talk about group work, another way to engage, you work on, you're kind of teaching group dynamics, and they have to try to work on something as a group. They kind of have to find a leader or all find their place. And ideally you want the group to be enthusiastically involved in the discussion. And even if they're talking about some things that aren't directly related, you know, if they get off on a little bit of a tangent or they get to know each other some, there's value in all of that. So a lot of this, you'll notice, is student-centered. We aim for the student to be self-learning. We want the sessions to be very student-centered. Like Carol just gave a great example of that. We are the guide, and we're moderating discussions. We're asking questions, you know, so kind of prompting, like, you said this, tell me more. Like, what does that look like? We're encouraging participation. We're engaging in participation in different activities if that's appropriate. So we're not just, again, at the front of the class lecturing forward. Yeah, I like facilitator a lot, Carol. I actually kind of took on that term when I was doing some mentorship training with other teachers. So I was like very much facilitating them rather than teaching them, because they knew just as much, if not more, than me. And so when we're doing student-centered learning, we're helping the learner to determine their own way of learning, right? So we've talked about learning styles. They can start to see, like, oh, I learn well when I'm listening. I learn well when I'm taking notes. I engage more when we're doing group work, you know, and they start to learn that. And then they recognize and reflect on the content rather than just this one way. Going back to that visual, if I'm just in front of the class lecturing, it's a one way. It just kind of comes in and maybe it sticks and maybe it doesn't, right? But if I'm reflecting and if I recognize the content and I'm reflecting and I'm either saying it to other people in my group, I'm teaching it back to the teacher, or I'm doing an essay on it, or I'm brainstorming on it, now there's much more of a process. It's come in and I have to reflect on what I already know or what I just learned and process it out. And so it helps participants to take responsibility for their own growth and for their awareness and be more self-directed. We can also get more done. We can get the investment in participants when we do it this way. It involves and improves group dynamics, increases participation, improves problem solving and creativity. And I love this idea that we can get creativity going in our groups. Like Carol's example of doing like a case study and them having to come up with one and then also answer to one. There's a lot of creativity there. So you're sparking different things in the brain. All right, that was a lot of me. Your turn, Susanna.
Thank you. Well, I will going to speak a little bit about agency because it's a concept which is very closely related with all of these Carrie talk about. And agency is, I don't know if you had the chance to read the chapter that we sent by email, but it could help our discussion of this concept and these ideas. Agency is linked to theories such as self-determination, the development of a growth mindset, or self-regulation. And according to these, students are actively engaged with learning, as Carol said, becoming agentic in their own curriculum and learning path. In other words, students were perceived as equal agents in the university, and this was a big change from a lecture where the professor had all the knowledge and just have to give that knowledge without any concern of what, if it was being clear, if it was being useful in any ways for these kind of understanding of the learning process as an active and dynamic process that also involves students. And it's more than just also involving students, is considering the student in the center of this learning process. So agency is a dynamic
Dr. Monica
process.
speaking.
Sorry? I'm sorry, I didn't
Due to
understand.
network issue, and I am on the way.
Okay. Agency is a dynamic process that is generated through a range of elements within education, and it is co-produced by the individual when it relates to objects and to other students and professors and other agents. So students need to learn to become agentic in their own learning process when making complex and unexpected decisions about their own learning process. This means that we cannot expect our students to become agentic if they are not prepared to that. It's the same with autonomy or with critical thinking. If we don't prepare them for that kind of skills, they don't be able to develop them by themselves. So agency is related to student ownership of their learning, to make decisions and have a voice about how, when, and what they learn. Please, Carol. Yes, thank you. Although many teachers, many professors recognize the importance of making students active agents in the classroom, it is easy to overlook students' agency when we plan our sessions, our lessons. However, the ability to make key decisions about their learning is a powerful motivator, and it's very important in motivation and engagement. So I found this table that presents us a summary of key questions that we can make and help us to do a better plan regarding the agency of our students. What select carefully the subject or topic, how decide on the process, and why define the purpose and create a product. And for each one of these topics, we have some more questions to address when we plan our lessons and our sessions. So the next one, please. So students' agency, it's related to the several dimensions of our teaching, of the teaching and learning process. Assessment, learning design, literacy strategies, learning how to learn, collaboration, technology, all of these aspects are important and interfere with student agency. Carrie? And also related with this multi-dimensional concept, we have all these aspects that are going to be interfering with agency development of our students. And I will have an example of my practice of what I do with my students, and it's related with peer assessment. I give my students the opportunity to evaluate themselves one to each other. So Carrie, please. Here's some benefits of peer assessment. It can develop your own critical and evaluate capacities, gain a better understanding of academic requirements, deepen your understanding and tightening your learning. And please feel free to interrupt me to ask some questions or had some thoughts, please. The next slide is just to, it's a funny comment from Calvin, but it's about the importance of clear instructions. And it is, I don't know if I can say this, but it is even more important when we are dealing with peer assessment. But in fact, it is always important, even when we as teachers, as professors that are making an assessment, it is very, very important to have clear instructions to our students. It is very important that they understand what is what are the criteria by which they are being evaluated. Carol says, I have each participant do a presentation, then I have evaluation forms to be filled out by their peers, providing constructive feedback of their efforts. Yes, it's a different way of peer assessment too, and it's very important because involves, engages all the participants in the assessment process, and that is very important. Just one more issue to tell you about these two characteristics of assessment that are very important: transparency and authenticity. Transparency is about the need for digital transformation. I'm sorry, I'm talking from a digital assessment perspective. I told you this was an example of my practice, and as I work with digital education, transparency, it's not exclusively about digital assessment, but in this case, it's my focus, my perspective. So it's the need for digital translation, for sale and negotiation, for evaluation by all participants. And it implies the involvement of students from the sharing of the evaluation process and procedures to possible contributions in the definition of goals and performance evaluation. Authenticity is a dimension recognized as fundamental for a competency or a skill-based student who is in the vicinity of the real world, recognized as a significant assessment by students and teachers, meeting the student profile or compulsory learning, for example. Some questions. When you have a concrete, yes, it's true, Carol. You cannot fall asleep if you have a concrete task to develop, and if you have if you are engaged with some task or some discussion or some project. It's very true. Harry, please, the next one.
Yeah, just to add to that, I say in the same way, some of these other engagements we talked about, engagement techniques, like I said, when I have my students do a teach back, yes, they may start to disengage once they've done theirs and they're listening to other people or whatever, but before there's kind of like a nervous energy and they're trying to get ready and they're, and then they present. So there's a large piece where they are certainly engaged because they know that they're going to be on stage, so to speak. And obviously if there's going to be an assessment done of your piece, there's that as well. So questions, what questions do people have or comments? Do you agree, disagree? Didn't mean to do that just yet.
In my experience with these peer assessment activities, students can be more straight than professors in following that criteria. Mm-hmm. So it is also important for them to understand the evaluation from the other side. So they become also less complaining when we present them our assessment and our process of evaluation. Another important thing, sorry, Carrie.
Well, I was just going to highlight, that's a great point because they really understand the assessment process if they're not just on the receiving end, but on the end of assessing others. And they certainly can't claim to not understand or know what they're being assessed on. Also, in my experience, they might be a little more, I don't want to say harder on their peers, but they hold them to a high standard in a positive way.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Cautiously, because they also know that they're going to be evaluated afterwards.
Right.
So if they really rip into someone may rip into them.
Yeah. So maybe it's a good balance is what I should say. I tend to be like a softer critiquer. So maybe I find them to be a little harder compared to me.
I think also by doing the evaluation of their peers, they're also becoming aware of areas that they need to be aware of, which if they were passive observers, they wouldn't be.
Right. So it's kind of that I'm thinking visually, it's kind of that whole thing about, Carol, if you're telling me something, I'm just receiving, right? And hopefully I'm getting some percentage of it. But if I'm receiving, analyzing, reflecting, giving feedback, now it's a whole, and receiving, there's just so many more opportunities for it to stick, and for it to actually mean something to me.
Exactly.
Yep. Excellent. Okay, Susanna, you had another point you wanted to make?
Just had something when you before said that sometimes you ask your students to elaborate a concept and then present them to the classroom. It is also important because of the language. It's more close between them. So it's again a peer strategy that is always a good one.
That's a good point, and they're going to present it right. They're going to present it differently than me, and they may use different examples that make more sense to their peers. You're right, and I see them explaining it to each other in groups before they even present, which is neat, right? So one will ask a question, and the other one will say, "Well, no, but it says here. I think that what this means is, So there's so much learning going on in the engagement and before they even present to the larger group. And some of them groan, like I said, they don't always love it, but they do what they got to do. And I do try to be respectful to different learning styles. So if one of them is really nervous and that's not their way or whatever, then I try to be like, okay, well, one of you is taking notes and one of you is the presenter, and there's ways to get around that. Any other questions or comments relating to, it doesn't just have to be, the agency piece, but motivation, engagement, or agency? All right, I see we have a question in the chat. Just give me a second to get that up here. How do you deal with students who are reluctant or maybe want to remain passive absorbers? How do you reconcile with individuals who want to be left on their own? Susanna, you want to jump on that or you want me to?
Yes, I can start and then you add your experience, which is different.
Perfect.
If you have from the beginning an assessment criterion which implies the participation of the student, and if the student doesn't participate, if he is not active in the tasks he has asked for, well, he doesn't have a good classification. He doesn't have a good assessment because he didn't follow the rules. Yet we have some flexibility, and the previous module we talked a little bit about that, and when we talked about learning styles, and it's important to have some flexibility, and sometimes I do that, and I let my students choose some alternatives on their activities, so they can write text, for example, or they can do a video, for example. It's the same work, but the way to present it's different, but somehow students must be involved, engaged, and present some work. It's not possible just to be a passive subject, maybe in a webinar, but not in a formal course, a training course, in my opinion.
Right. I think you brought up some great points that are similar. I have an expectation in my course that there will be participation. And as you said, it may look different. I've had students come up to me and say, I'm just not going to talk. Like, there's just no way. I get too nervous. So sometimes it'll be something as simple as, we'll bring in one question from the text. So you don't have to, impromptu say something in the middle of class or give your opinion, but maybe you just come in with one question that you've already prepared. And of course, remember that participation doesn't have to be verbal participation. Participation and engagement is also writing an essay, reflecting on what was learned, so that's not being a passive absorber, sitting just if you listen to the lectures, you are part of the discussion, you're part of the class, and then you reflect on something and write an essay or respond to, prompts. That is still engagement. It's just a different form of engagement, like Susanna was mentioning. So I think we don't want to get, we've used a lot of examples that are verbal participation live in class, but we don't want to get so close-minded that that's the only part that we see as participation, because it's not. It's a great question. Thank you. Any other questions or comments? Have you tried any of this and not had good luck?
I think a big piece of getting people to participate is creating safety. For example, when
And
I
empathy.
do a role play or something,
Mm-hmm.
if I see somebody struggling, I'll stop it. I'll ask the other participants, what they would do. And I may even say, okay, you have a great idea. You switch places with this person and take over.
Mm-hmm.
So that nobody feels like they're on the spot and have no exit.
I think that is huge. It also gives, that group cohesion and supporting one another. Sometimes someone will make a comment and I'll ask them a question and I can just tell right away they don't know. And I'll be like, well, it doesn't have to be you. I'm just following up on what you said, who wants to help, and other people will jump in. And, and the fact is, usually if you get a large enough group, you have people who like to participate and you have people who don't. And then you have people who will kind of begrudgingly or are in the middle. And so that's another reason why having different roles can be helpful. Like you said, with a role play is a great example. Someone may be great at writing the role play. Someone may be great at giving feedback on it, but doesn't want to play a role. Some people absolutely love playing the roles. Like if I get to be a difficult client, sign me up. I want to play that role all day. So it just, a lot of it, as you said, Carol, is trust and also relationship. So especially, you want to know your students as, to the extent that that's reasonable and possible. All right, do we have another question? Oh, thank you. All right, well, if no one has any more questions, I think we can start to wrap up and just let you know to watch for module 5. We have 5, 6, 7, and 8 still to come, so we hope that you will join us.